Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to introduce ourselves, but I thought before we introduce ourselves, I would just quickly say how this came to be. So Amy Weber and I met years ago at a networking event and have reconnected recently, and we're having this conversation about um, um, this idea that both of us were seeing where, sort of two sides of the same coin that we'll talk about. One of which was sales processes not being really well solidified in agencies on Amy's side, and then on my side, seeing leadership structures not being sort of stable and so forth. And so we thought, wow, these are really two sides of the same coin. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Jeff Siegel. My background is in marketing on the client side. I worked at Nabisco, the Hershey Company. I worked for Ahold, which is the parent company of a bunch of grocery chains up in the Northeast. Stop and Shop and Giant, if anybody lives in the Northeastern US. And then I worked as the head of marketing at Cracker Barrel, but now I have to say to people, not recently. So I had nothing to do with that logo mess that they got into last year. But anyway, so that's my background. And now I've shifted gears and I do leadership advising, executive coaching, and training leadership teams for marketing teams, for agencies, etc. And I will pass it over to Amy to introduce herself.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Yes, we had a lot of fun at that networking event a number of years ago and reconnected. My background comes from I grew up collecting ads. I used to have scrapbooks of print campaigns that were my favorites, and so I always knew I wanted to get into advertising, but I never knew what the right spot was for me. And I credit the HR woman at the first agency I worked at. She saw my persistence, my diligence, determination, one might say dog with a bone mentality that really was necessary to find a job in 2008 job market. But really, she pushed me towards business development and recommended that sort of polite persistence is something necessary and that would help me to survive it and really thrive in that type of a role. And so after 5 years at a big holding company, I took a step back and realized small independent shops are a passion of mine and an area that I like to be working with. And so I found my home working for some small agencies. And then about a year and a half ago, I decided to go out on my own for two reasons. On a personal note, I have two elementary school aged kiddos, and I would say showing up at this age matters. I don't get this time back, and so a couple days a week, I get to create my own schedule and be mom in the afternoons. I'll be picking them up at 2:30 today, but I still have a couple days a week where I have full work days and get to really dig in on my professional side and on the professional side what it allows me to do is work across non-competitive small indie shops and really bring my senior level experience to coaching and guiding and ultimately selling for these organizations and that's really what brought us here today to talk about the ideal agency and how we pull that together. And so, as a few folks are still jumping in and whatnot, I think we wanted to kick off today just by asking folks in the audience, what does an ideal agency look like for you? Can anyone toss in the chat just a few little thoughts as far as what's your ideal successful agency? You'd
And
like the hold
yeah,
music.
we'll let people. The whole thing. Well, why don't we, as people are doing that, if you're typing something in or whatever, please do. I love that. Michaela added true and seamlessly integrated. I think that word true is really important there too, right? Um, awesome. if anyone else is going to drop anything in there, here we've got Faye says illuminates new strategic and creative perspectives. Susan says creative and collaborative. Excellent. These are all great. I'm really interested, Amy, in hearing what you think of as an ideal agency.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think I agree, and all those answers resonate for me. I think for me, a lot on the ideal agency has paced growth. So I grew up. My dad always said. I remember growing up, he would say to me, "If you're not growing, you're dying," which is kind of morbid and awful to think about, but it's constant evolution and really again in a paced way though. You don't want wild swings. Of course there are strong years that are really good and weak years that are really hard, but if ultimately over a multi-year period you have that paced growth, to me that's pretty ideal from an agency perspective. I also see a lot from a strategic growth perspective. So in order to get there, having that clear picture of where you want to head towards from both a products and services standpoint, as well as from your ideal customer profile standpoint, really that strategy allows you to kind of put the building blocks on top of each other. But I think the last piece of it is flexible growth. And so, really being able to identify those targets that you're looking to work with, but then also, you know, leave space or leave flexibility for the inbound opportunities that you don't necessarily see coming, and really allowing for those pivots that come along the way, or the spaces or categories that maybe you don't even predict will be coming at some point. So I think that's an ideal agency from my growth lens. Jeff, what would you say is your ideal agency from a leadership stability lens?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, my background comes from, client side marketing, worked with many agencies in my career, and I've worked with agencies in my my current coaching and consulting work. And we'll talk a little bit about the symptoms of what I see, what I often see, both on client side and agency side, and frankly, even outside of the marketing world, is this idea of chaos sort of taking over. And I'll talk more about that later. But so to me, it's really about, I like to say that all business problems ultimately are human problems. And so for me, I'm always looking at the problem from the lens of like, what's going wrong here in terms of either people not understanding, a common purpose, people, wrong people in wrong seats, people aren't prepared, whatever it is, all those things that you need to make sure are true from a human perspective. So I guess, from an ideal agency perspective, frankly, an ideal marketing team perspective is really that human side of things is really well set up so that people really truly understand what their roles are, what they're supposed to do, what decisions they are allowed to make, and what decisions they need to get, more input from more senior folks in, and that things have been really thoughtfully and intentionally set up so that that need for senior involvement is minimized as much as possible, because that really is the key to, back to Amy's point about sales growth. The key to agency growth is if you want to grow, you have to be able to increase your throughput of decisions, right? You have to be able to make more and more decisions as time goes on. And if the team is well trained to make those decisions, then you have a stability in your structure, then you're going to be able to grow. If you are unstable and constantly kind of just, ad hoc trying to figure things out, it's going to be really hard to grow. So
Yeah,
that's
I
sort
I love
of,
that, and I think that was part of why, as we reconnected and have talked more, I just felt like our two challenges that we often solve for are two sides of the same coin, as you said, to borrow your phrase from earlier. And I
yeah.
think think what's important and interesting about what you're saying there is it in a creative industry where really human capital is the product that we're creating, having that clarity and having that, people lack of people problems, I guess, as you said, like business problems often come down to people problems. I think that's more true in my experience in marketing and agency life than in other corporate world and or I often refer back to my husband's a scientist and some things in science just don't work. But in the creative world, there's a solution for everything. We can throw money at it, we can throw creativity at it, we can throw time at it. We can make it work. And I think in order to do that, the people portion has to be ironed out.
100%. Well, let's do this because we'll come back to that people part, which I love talking about, and I'll I don't want to take up the whole time, but I really would love to hear you and I, when we first talked about this, we're talking about that idea of a um or like why do agencies stall? And so maybe just asking folks from your experiences, what doesn't work, what brought you to this discussion today, and then maybe Amy, you can give us your take on what causes that stall.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I can start off while people, if you have thoughts in the chat around why you've seen different agencies stall, toss them in there to help with a collective brainstorm. But from me, from the perspective that I've seen from on the sales side of the house, I think a lot of times what drives sales stalling is what I call a reactive sales process. And it's the highs are high and the lows are low. And so oftentimes, and we can get into this more as the conversation continues, but many times it's you're either on a new business tear and you're seeing that growth in an exponentially positive way, or you're seeing a really big cliff happening. And I think that often then it becomes a very lumpy sales process. And so agencies will often have a really great new business streak, but especially small and mid-sized agencies then have to service those accounts that they win. And so what naturally happens is they turn the attention to servicing the accounts and sales efforts decrease. And then as they look 4, 6 months down the road and they wonder where's the new business and the next level of growth that they're trying to hit, they've stopped doing all of the top of funnel activities in service of the clients they just won, and then there's a pitfall. And so and that really stalls that agency at that next level of growth. So that's what I've often seen from a business development perspective. I like also Susan's comment in the chat here around generalists versus specialists. And so, do you do everything? Are you everything to everyone, or are you specialist or niche in what your offering is? And I have some thoughts on that, Susan. So, in terms of focusing on, I think it goes back a little bit to focusing on where strategically you want to grow, but also leaving space for that unexpected niche 20% extra. So that's what I've seen as far as why agencies stall on the sales side of the house. Jeff, what have you seen from an operations perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what I see causes, and like I said, I've seen this happen. It's not just an agency phenomenon, but again, it's that sort of unstable leadership structure. I was kind of getting at it before, this idea that like every decision is having to go through one or two people. There's lack of sort of alignment. There's often lip service to like, oh, we're delegating, everybody has ownership, but the reality is nobody actually has ownership because they're all sort of waiting for a decision to come from somewhere. That then what happens is, and that then leads to lack of clear processes like the sales process that you're describing, which means that the team is doesn't have clarity on what it is that's what they're supposed to do next, nor do they have clarity about what's coming next, which then creates this kind of like, I don't know, sort of frenetic energy of like, oh, the sky is always falling, and so the team is always kind of running around trying to figure out how we're gonna solve the problem of the day, as opposed to having that stability. And that's a you can look at that as a process problem, but you can also look at that as a leadership problem, because in the end of the day, leadership should be less focused on solving those problems and more focused on how do I create that stability so that the team can solve those problems. I often say it's not, at that, the further up you move in an agency role, the less your work is about getting things done, and the more it is about creating the conditions for things to get done. And so that's sort of that instability that I see from a leadership side that clearly plays into the sales process, and often plays into all sorts of other processes within the agency. Like you'll see sort of agency processes don't, I mean, operational processes that don't work, and frankly, briefing processes that don't work, and you'll see client management processes that don't work, and so the client is constantly throwing stuff out, and you're like, oh, I guess we need to do that today, and we need to do that today, and there's no real sort of clarity around, well, how, what are the agreements in place that say, hey, when a client asks for this, it is actually okay to push back, or it is okay when a client asks for something that's way out of scope to say to them, hey, we'd love to do that with you, that's way out of scope. But if you don't have any of those processes in place, you're going to end up with chaos, and that chaos is really driven, from my perspective, by leadership not understanding that's their whole role, right? Leadership has to create the stability for everyone else while the agency is growing. So, um, I'm kind of getting into this a little bit on the leadership style already, but Amy, what I'd be interested to hear from you. You talked about some of these things, but what are the symptoms that, one should be looking for in an agency that or at least what that you look for? What are the symptoms where you go, well, this agency has a reactive sales process?
Yeah, great question. And I think there's a couple of different indicators that I've seen where, really that to me shows much more of a reactive versus a strategic, thoughtful, and planned approach to it. As you said, I alluded to this a little bit before, but often this sort of long and what I call lumpy sales cycle. We can't control clients. You can only control the things you can control, and clients are not one of them. And so it can be very unpredictable. One of my longest sales cycle deals took over 2 years. I secured an MSA with another major organization. It was over 6 months from the day we won the account to when the MSA was signed because of all of that back and forth. And so, that leads you to be very reactive and sort of chasing different things, and that lumpy sales cycle where I've seen agencies that are really focused on the task at hand and closing the deal. But what that leads them to is ignoring other key parts of the sales cycle. And so I often talk about how I think in sales funnels. I think in really moving folks through that general awareness of you as an agency down to that conversion moment. And so I'd say the second really key indicator of a reactive sales process is an uneven distribution of the sales funnel. And I think that can come to life in one of two ways. I think it could be that the agency from a bandwidth and time perspective can only focus on so much at any given moment. I mean, we all only have 24 hours in a day, and my watch is constantly telling me, sleep more. You need more sleep today. So we can only do what we can do, and so you have to prioritize and focus on different parts of the funnel at different times. But how can you set up systems and processes in place so that there's automation taking place or things happening? So if you have to take a week and focus on closing a deal and going back and forth with lawyers over an MSA 700 times, how do you still know that there's some marketing and higher order taking place from that sales funnel perspective? And I think on the other side of it, what often happens too is what I like to call the shiny object syndrome. So, another reactive agency indicator for me is when you hear of a new technology or you see something new, and that, Susan, to your point, really becomes that everything and anything. And I still chuckle at Allbirds becoming an AI company, and it's like just completely ditch the sneakers and go in all in on a SaaS tech product. And so I think if you do that, you lose your core business. And so, how do you find that sweet spot and not just get
Mhm.
distracted by the flavor of the week? And then I think, for me, the last piece on the reactive agency, symptoms, things that I see, is generally speaking just misalignment of the team. And that's where, Jeff, you and I have such shared views on
Yeah,
gaining that consensus piece of it.
absolutely. Well, so what, in your view, what causes this to happen? I mean, this is sort of, it's like it's not rocket science. We all kind of know, like, oh, okay, those symptoms probably aren't good, but why does it happen when, if people can see these things and they know they're not right or whatever, what causes this situation to come up?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not rocket science. As you say, it's we're doing advertising and marketing and creative services, selling that human capital. And so at our core, if we all had infinite hours in the day, we know the things that we should be doing or need to be doing. Um, but and I think it's hard to fit it all in and to make it all happen. And I think there's a few things that can help bring structure, or that I say there's a few things that create that more frantic and more reactive sales process that I've seen. I think lack of clear picture on who your ideal customer profile is. Who is that ICP? Who's the person that's going to buy from you? And really thinking about it from the perspective as well, as far as who might buy from you in the next month, who might buy from you in 6 months, who might buy from you in 6 years, and what's the
Mhm.
right level of effort to put against them. And without that clarity on who those ICPs are, it's really hard to understand, and it creates that reactive perspective. I think another cause of this reactive is an inability to move deals through the phases of that sales funnel. Some of that we can control, some of it we can't control. And so it's really important that agencies set boundaries or set parameters up so that if one deal stalls, you don't have all your eggs in that basket. But when you can't move the deals through the phases, either because of lack of time or lack of client movement on their end, it can really create this chaotic sales process. And a lot of times, ultimately, what it comes down to is time being spent in the wrong places, focusing on deals or things that are too small, or focusing on things that are too big, one way or the other. And so, thinking about how you can, recognizing that. If you're not focused in the right space, the cause, that will cause that more chaotic sales process for you.
So now that you've shared with us all the things that can go wrong, what is your what's sort of the high level view of your prescription for this kind of these symptoms and causes?
Yeah. So I think a clarity of plan, both short and long term, in terms of what it is that you're hoping to accomplish, and really thinking about that from the growth perspective, what feels like a healthy growth for the organization that you can staff against and that you can build towards. And again, what are those products, services, and clients or industries that you want to be going after, that can really help you hone in on what the right areas of growth should be for you as an organization. Once you've mapped that all out, then it's thinking about ways to identify those, what I like to call lowest hanging fruit. And so some of those things are running, as simple as running a sales campaign to all of your lapsed clients. Bye, Zach. Sorry to see you go, but yes, we'll share the recording. So running a sales campaign to all of your lapsed clients, who maybe you worked with 2 to 5 years ago, but haven't been in touch with since. And so really kind of identifying those folks, maybe they've moved from one company to another and now they'd be willing to bring you in there. And so thinking about it from that paced growth perspective. But then, as I said, I mentioned earlier, kind of leaving that flexibility in a growth perspective. And that's where you want to take what I like to call targeted big swings, on opportunities that could potentially change your business. So maybe you've really, honed in on one niche area, and there's a tangential, industry or category that you'd love to break into. How do you potentially really just take a big swing and go at them with a big idea, something business changing for them, but that would also be business changing for you and help you to break in there. And really it's having that, so having that sort of structured plan in place, both short term and longer term, and then committing to it and doing it. And it's so hard. And it's I think, I love to use the example of, I know how to do a sit up. I've mastered a sit up. Stick your feet under the couch. I can do them right in the living room. That's great. But I do sit ups on Wednesday mornings. And the reason I do sit ups on Wednesday mornings is because that's when I have allocated an hour and I meet with my trainer, and that's when they happen. And so allocating and dedicating that time, whether that's through an accountability buddy or something on the team, or different accountability measures in place. Everyone on Friday says the top 3 things they did for sales that week, or the top 3 things they're committing to do for sales the following week. Really having those processes in place allows you to just continue moving that ball forward, and allows you in the high sales success times to keep going, because that's when you want to collect more, and in the low times to make sure that you're staying resilient, even though it feels really hard in this moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think, Jeff? Any questions on that? Does that align with kind of what we talked about?
No, absolutely. And as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about how important that I mean, there's that saying that like, revenue covers all, issues or whatever it is. But what you're talking about is actually really important is like you actually have to the reason you want to have a disciplined sales process is so that in the in the bad times you know what to do, and in the good times you don't sort of get into this sort of comfort zone where you're going to basically end up in trouble 3 months
Right.
from now
6 months
without
down the
even
road. You have
real.
to always be planting those seeds because of that lumpy and unpredictable sales cycle and the things you can't control.
Yeah, absolutely.
But all right. Well, I've been in the hot seat long enough. Jeff,
Sure.
can I turn the tables to you and have you
Of
talk
course.
a little bit about, the symptoms of overcoming, how do you identify that unstable leadership that often exists, within
Yeah.
these?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think some of these ideas will probably sound familiar from what Amy was just talking about. But what I see, as I said, I've seen this in agencies. I've also seen it in marketing teams. I've seen it in other businesses. But I call it the chaos cycle. And my funny thing that I sometimes say is like I recently had went to the dermatologist and he was doing a skin check to make sure I didn't have anything that and he knew exactly what he was looking for, and he like saw it, and he immediately knew what the what it was and what he needed to do, and whatever. Um, and that's how I feel about when I walk into a company and I see the following things going on. I'm like, oh, this is what I call the chaos cycle. And the chaos cycle from a symptom perspective looks like, I mean, the biggest symptom is constant firefighting. Like you are literally every minute of the day, you are dealing with one crisis after another. Something is, something's late. The client needs something at the last minute. Nothing's ready, whatever. So that constant firefighting mode is actually a symptom of unstable leadership. I think a lot of times I often hear people in agencies like, oh no, the agency world that's just what it's like. And I'm like, yes, the agency world is tough. I mean, like there's always a lot of stuff coming at you, but the question isn't how do we just survive? It's like how do we create processes that allow us to deal with the fact that like stuff happens all the time. The client suddenly needs something or whatever. But if you don't have those processes in place, you will absolutely end up in constant firefighting mode. In fact, in the restaurant world, where I worked for a number of years, there was this thing they talk about like you never want the general manager of the restaurant to jump on the grill and start flipping burgers because if they do that, that means that chaos has taken over because now that leader can no longer, tell the host to slow down the how fast they're seating people or tell the servers, hey, don't have people order burgers because the grill is overwhelmed or whatever. And all of a sudden, all you can do is flip burgers. And all that does is create more, guests or ordering burgers. And this is what happens in the agency world as well. It's like the more you sort of get all hands jumping in and fixing all the problems, there's nobody left to kind of be like, how do we manage these client relationships better? Or how do we create processes that allow us to manage these things? So that constant firefighting, everything constant fire kind of hand in hand with constant firefighting is everything is last minute. Like
Mhm.
there's literally like you might have known that something was coming for 6 months, but you were so busy with every other fire that you were fighting that you basically had to do it in the last possible minute, which means that everybody's working late, working weekends. I don't know, does this sound familiar to anyone? And the other symptom that you see that go with the other two symptoms you see that go with this when it gets really bad is that especially the senior leaders are drowning in meetings. They're in just meeting all day long, constant meetings, trying to like, deal with all these, problems and decisions that need to get made. And then the last symptom that I'm sure people will recognize is just people quitting. You just end up with lots of people kind of going, I'm not putting up with this. Because ultimately, I always say to people, there are five things people want in their job, right? The number one thing that people want to do is they want to work in a place that's not chaotic. They want stability, right? So they want stability. They want to know that they're contributing. They want to know that they have the tools to, do their job well. They want to know that there's growth. And then the very last thing I always put last is they want to make sure that they have fair compensation. And I don't mean to put that as, like unimportant, but the reality is most people leave an agency or a marketing team, not because of their compensation. I mean, they often go out and look for jobs and find out the compensation is, might be better, but they most of the time leave because of one of those other things. And I would say a lot of the time it's that instability, that chaos, whatever. And so they're just getting frustrated and annoyed. And I don't feel like showing up in this mess every day. Why am I doing this? And so I don't know, those are the symptoms that I usually notice almost
I,
immediately. So,
yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I in on the personal side of the house, I'm going to commit now to eliminating the chaos and buying the end of year teacher gift this weekend because Thursday is the last day of school. So I will not be going to Target on Wednesday night divide the gifts. Here's hoping at least. Got to make a little note for myself there. So those are the symptoms that you've seen. You walk in, you diagnose right away. You say, "I got this."
Yeah.
What leads to that? What are some of those causes that bring us to that moment?
Yeah, so the cause, I always say there's three causes to that chaos cycle. And they're sort of at three different levels. There's the senior level, sort of the middle level, and then the sort of individual contributor level. So the causes are, I'll start at the top. The top of the house, the most senior leaders, the biggest cause is that they don't trust their team. Now, there's often some reason why they don't trust their team. They don't trust their team because some big mistake happened 2 years ago with some client, whatever, and something went wrong, and it was a big problem. And so now they're like, we have to check everything. We have to be involved in every decision, right? Because if, and everything has to go through us and whatever. So their lack of trust is sort of makes their time get totally this is where all those meetings come from, is their time gets totally filled up with, we have to be involved in every decision. I have to hear about everything that's going on. The second thing is just a really fascinating thing, and I could probably, have a whole conversation with this. In fact, I think Rebecca, who's on this call, and I probably have had this conversation before on her podcast, but is this idea of crisis leadership, that there are people in usually in the middle roles. Often it's like the whoever's in charge of the account team, or operations, or whatever it is, or it's somebody over the creative group or whatever, and they do what I call crisis leadership. And crisis leadership is, these are people who are amazing because at some point when that bad mistake happened, 2 years ago, and it was, near disaster, these are the people that have saved the day. Right? They came in, they swooped in, they fixed things, they got, they calmed the client down, whatever it is. And the problem that happens with these folks, these crisis leaders, is they almost start to derive their value from solving crises. And so they, instead of kind of looking at the situation going, how do I make sure the next crisis doesn't happen? They actually almost inadvertently create new crises, because that's how they, sort of win the day, right? And so, I'm only exaggerating a little bit, but I have seen this in my own career. I've seen it in, in agencies, on marketing teams. I sometimes call this person the funnel, because everything has to go through them, and they're just trying to, kind of, um the other term I sometimes use is marionette everything, right? They're like, I'm the only one who can save the day, right? And then the third piece of the puzzle is what I call victimization. So all the people at the most junior levels, the individual contributors, are all sitting there going, why is this happening to me? Instead of and usually it's because they haven't been trained properly to, how to deal with this kind of situation. Is what you really need is to train those people at the most junior levels on how to manage up. How do they show up in their boss's office and not say, I don't know what to do, but come into their boss's office and say, here's what I've already looked into. Here's what I've already tried. Here's what the obstacle that I'm good. I just need you to do this because I'm not able to do it. So I need you, boss, to do this thing. And they're kind of basically taking charge, even at the most junior levels. And it's tough, it's tough, because often you have, in agencies at the most junior levels, you often have, young people who have, this is their many times their first or second job. They don't have a lot of experience. They don't necessarily know what they're looking for or how to manage this. And then more importantly, nobody ever trains anyone how to manage up. And so they don't know how to manage up, and then they're stuck, sort of just trying to figure it out. And so they get into this victimization mode of like, this craziness, this chaos that's just happening to me. And so it's really those three things happening all at once: the lack of trust at the top, the crisis leadership in the middle, and the folks on the bottom not really having been trained on how to kind of manage up the chaos. Without that, you end up with this very sort of, self-perpetuating chaotic situation.
Yeah, absolutely. No job stability like one where you're making the problems and solving them all at the same time. Um, so you started to get into this a little bit as you were talking about victimization, and doing some training, but how do you fix this? So
Yeah.
I'm in chaos right now. How do I help my agency move to that next level?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I guess, as somebody who does training and coaching, I always look at it from that angle. And it's like, there's a couple of pieces of the puzzle, right? I guess the first thing I'll talk about is, does everybody understand the purpose of what it is we're all trying to do here? So make sure that people are trained and have understanding of like, here's what we're trying to accomplish, right? Like, by the way, it's always interesting. Like the agency, it's very easy in an agency to think that your job is to get the work done for the client. And that is true, but it is not the purpose of the agency. The purpose of the agency is to get more business, right? And so how do you make sure everybody understands that purpose? How do you make sure that you have the right people in the right places? I mean, there's nothing worse. And I mean, I talked a little bit about that sort of funnel crisis leader character. When it's really bad, sometimes the best thing to do is just move that person out of that role because they're so stuck in this, way of working that you either need to put them in a different role, or sometimes, unfortunately, you actually have to move them out of the organization if they're really, really, just can't get out of that mode. Um, the other thing, of course, is process. Like, what do our processes look like? So you have to coach people at the more senior levels of like, hey, how do you look at the processes that we have for getting work done, for sales processes, like what you were talking about, whatever, and make sure that we have the right processes in place, because having the right process in place sometimes can make it so that work that, you can create a process that can be adaptive to curveballs, things showing up and whatever. Or you can just have a process that's very rigid, but what will happen is when something not rigid happens, all of a sudden your process goes out the window and then you don't have any process at all. And then the last piece is what um, I sometimes call preparation. So, I talked about purpose, people, process, preparation. I needed it to be alliterative, but really by preparation, what I mean is training. How do you train those junior people on how to manage up? How do you train the people in the middle to understand your role is not to do the work, but to create the conditions where you trust your team to get the work done at a very high level, even when you're not involved. Because when you can get them able to do the work at that next level, you can get out of that work and be focusing on bigger things like fixing processes and so forth. And then at the senior most level, it's really about how do you get the senior most level to actually think about culture from the perspective of like, we're going to create a culture that focuses on, people feeling like this place is stable, we're not chaotic. Like I said before, that people feel that they're able to make a contribution, that people feel like they have the right tools to do their job, and they feel like they have opportunities to grow. And if you can create a culture of sort of learning and growth and collaboration, as a number of people put into the chat, then you can really, solve this sort of set of symptoms, and this chaos cycle syndrome, whatever you call it. You can solve it pretty well. So that's really how I look at this. I think part of the reason that, Amy and I teamed up here was because we saw and hopefully you all can see this as well, the relationship between these two problems. Like, sales process is so important, because if you have, like, everything gets worse when you don't have the pipeline filled and whatever it is, and all of these leadership problems get, sort of amplified. And on the flip side, those leadership problems, if they don't get solved, lead to lack of sales processes, and it becomes this kind of vicious cycle. So I don't know, Amy, if you
Yeah.
have anything to add before we go to Q&A, but
I think this is the part where you and I arm wrestle and decide what gets dealt with first, the operations side of the house or the sales side of the house. No,
exactly.
all seriousness, I think, there's opportunity to address both at the same time, and oftentimes one informs the other. When you're thinking about the culture of the organization, you can't think about that without thinking about the types of clients that you want to attract, the types of products and services you want to offer. And on the flip side, you can't show up authentically to prospective clients and share that culture, and share that sales pitch without having a strong culture behind it that makes it feel authentic and whatnot. But
Absolutely.
yes, would love any Q&A from our audience if anybody has any.
Yeah, you are welcome to either go off mute on camera and jump in or drop a question in the chat, but we'd love to get your thoughts, reactions, experiences. Anyone feeling brave?
While folks are mustering up the courage, I think one of the things that you shared that really resonated well with me was that chaos agent and the fixer. And um, you know, I think I've seen in a number of instances where there's agencies or teams or organizations who claim to really thrive in chaos. And a couple of times, Jeff, you talked about minimal leadership input in the day-to-day work so that there's more delegation. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how it may seem counterintuitive that like less input from the leadership actually will lead to less chaos? Can you talk a little bit more about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I'm gonna grab an analogy from the restaurant world is when Ray Kroc, who's sort of known for creating McDonald's, the first restaurant already existed and he went into this restaurant, he was in Chicago and what he saw was like a bunch of 16-year-olds getting like 100 burgers out the door in like an hour, right? And what he looked at from that perspective was, wow, this is amazing. If I could take this idea and replicate it all over the country, it would be a gold mine. And that is how it wasn't. McDonald's originally wasn't the restaurant, it was the system that the restaurant was using, right? I mean, there were burger joints all over the country at the time, diners, whatever it is, but nobody had necessarily, sort of figured out the kind of how do we create something that's replicatable and scalable? And so, to answer your question, I think that the interesting thing that he was noticing was essentially they had created a system it wasn't that they had like a bunch of like genius 16-year-olds running this restaurant. It was that they had created this almost foolproof system of like, there was a line of, the equipment was in the right order, things were in the right places, the people were given the right, jobs were broken out in the right way. And so the answer to your question is when you have spent more time as an agency leader thinking about what are the processes, how do I get the right people in the right places? How do I make sure these people are trained in the right way? How do I make sure they understand what the goal of what their job is? If they understand all those things, then you have created the conditions where they can make decisions and they're not going to they're not making it like nobody has to make a decision in McDonald's how long to cook the burger, right? Because all the burgers come in, they're a standard size, a standard thickness, they all get cooked the same amount of time, whatever, because somebody thought about how to create a system where the decisions that are hard don't have to get made. And that's what I'm talking about is like if you can create the right conditions as the leader for your team, whether it's through training or process or whatever, now they don't have to think so hard about making these decisions and they're not going to make wrong decisions. Whereas if every single thing that they do, they have to kind of, you know, start over and reinvent the wheel every day, then you're going to have a lot more people at the top involved because people with less experience, more junior people, whatever, they just haven't seen these problems before. So that's what I mean. Like, if you can create the conditions for stability, you actually can make it so, the stability comes from having the processes, but also having the processes means you don't need so many people involved in decisions, which frees up the time, which creates that leadership capacity, if you will, for the growth that you can get from a sales perspective.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that resonates so well with the thought of the resilient agency, kind of just going back to where we started for all of this. And it's,
Sure.
that example of being able to have those processes in place, whether you're a team of four or a team of 14 or 40 or 400, you'll be able to grow and scale and flex with appropriate processes.
Absolutely. Are there any, I don't see any questions in the chat. Anybody have a question you want to jump in with? If not, I'm going to give Amy a question from, we asked our favorite audience member, ChatGPT, for some questions. So, it's always interesting to see what the large language models come up with. Well, so I think maybe one of the most interesting questions on the sales side is, yes, the whole process is important, but I know that everybody gets really, really focused on how do I build a consistent pipeline. So how do you build a consistent pipeline, especially when referrals have always been the primary source of business?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think it comes back to some of that work that I was talking about in terms of really honing in on the core industries that you're interested in pursuing and the targets within those. And recognizing where your greatest opportunities have come from and trying little micro campaigns against each one of those different audiences. So, if most of your work has come from referral business, try running a campaign where you get in touch with your, former clients and ask them all to make one networking introduction for you. Running, I use the word campaign. It can be as easy as just texting your old clients or sending them an email and saying, hey, would love an intro to this person. Or try running a campaign, as I mentioned before, to folks who you haven't worked with in over 2 years, but you've worked with in the past. Just remind them that you're there. So much of the successful sales comes from staying top of mind, and that's where the diet and exercise piece of it comes to play. And so I think you can do those things, and when there's bandwidth and time, those are great activities to do. Block an hour a week, do some outreach messages, work your network. But you can only scale so quickly with that. And there are so many tools and automation opportunities in this day and age. And so I've done a lot of work with agencies on what are some different tools we can use, still staying within your network. So think about like your second degree connections on LinkedIn. If you share 10 or more contacts with someone, there's a decent chance that they would just accept a cold LinkedIn connection. And then from there, you can start to build that relationship. And that can help you break into new brands, new geographies, new categories. And you can pretty easily set parameters within LinkedIn Sales Navigator and some of these AI tools that run on top of it in order to do this outreach at scale. So this outreach can be happening in the background while you are building your culture and making sure that you have no chaos agents in the middle of the world. So, I think it's a little bit of sweat and grit and a little bit of luck, but using some of those tools and setting up some things, setting aside the time to do the grit and the work and the hands on the keyboard, but then also setting up some systems in place to allow the automation to happen in the background for you. The combination of those I've seen successfully lead to those calls and opportunities.
Awesome. Well, I think we are coming very quickly up on the hour.